The title of the event today is Basic Instinct, Style versus Content. And while Sharon Stone is not with us this evening, I think we've done much better myself. I have 4 amazing authors with you, and let me introduce you to them now. On my far left is Leanne Shapton, the author of this beautiful book called Swimming Studies, a kind of mashup of memoir, cultural commentary, and beautiful visuals that Leanne has created herself. And her story about how she feels about having been a competitive swimmer and almost making it to the top. Beside her is Anakana Schofield, who comes to us with Malarkey, an exceptional novel about a woman who discovers that her son is gay and has, let me just say, a surprising reaction to that revelation. She's also suffering immense grief and loss and has to cope with that. It's really beautiful. It's called Malarkey. On my immediate right here is the author of Why, Marjorie Celona, about a girl who's trying to find out who she is, having found out that she was abandoned as a newborn at the Y by her mother. And also on her far right is Rebecca Lee, who brings Bobcat to us, a series of exceptional short stories. At first, they seem to be about intellectual issues, but they all have a huge emotional through line to them. Leanne and Rebecca and Marjorie are here thanks to Penguin Canada, and Anakana's here thanks to EWWC. So please welcome our 4 authors. They all also have exceptional resumes. I mean, these introductions do go on, but I know that you really want much more to hear from them. I would like to begin, because my sense is often, or let's just assume that not all of you has read all the books from all the authors. So I want to give them the opportunity to talk a little bit about their books. So, and I'd like to start, I failed to mention, with my apologies, that this is an event co-sponsored and celebrated by the World Writers' Conference in conjunction with IFOA and the Edinburgh Book Festival. We have delegates here with us from the World Writers' Conference who are going to be joining us in our conversation. But don't worry, you'll get to ask questions too. They're not going to dominate this conversation, no. I want to start with Rebecca, who's brought this book of short stories with us. Tell us a little bit about the book. In particular, I guess I'm interested in whether you feel like these short stories all share a theme, or maybe better to ask you, how did you bring this set of short stories together?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about whether they have a theme as we've been sort of figuring out a way to market the book and talk about the book as a whole. And really the only thing in my mind that brings them together, and this is not useful to a publisher at all, but it is for a writer, is that they all have a similar process in the way I wrote them. And in a way it's related to our topic tonight about style versus content. I was mostly reading heavily from a book by the architect Christopher Alexander, who has this idea of how creative work should work. This is really didactic, but it is a process that worked for me. He talks about the beginning of a process as kind of a shadowy idea, like the dream of something that you want to make happen. And then in the middle, there's a series of rules that the writer or the artist goes through that they set up to build something or make something. And then the end product is something that the artist has no control over. It's something more mysterious that belongs more to the reader, or in his case, he's an architect. He says the building belongs to the people who live in it. So for me, that's sort of the process and the way that like the content turned into the style of the stories. And as for themes, they're all kind of set in a university usually. And someone told me that I had an obsession with older religious men, which I didn't know, but apparently that's in the book too. So.
And how how do you go about choosing what the title story is?
You know, that was just like in a moment. I just like, I don't know, I just like bobcats themselves. So you know, it wasn't a really aesthetic decision. It was just kind of an instinct.
Leanne, this is, as I mentioned, a mashup of a couple of different things. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you that there's this fantastic section in the middle where there's about 25 bathing suits illustrated here. Excellently rendered, can I say, all of which were worn by Leanne at some point. But why a memoir of this kind? What made you feel like this was, you do so many things, you're an illustrator, you're an art director, you have so many gifts. Why a memoir, and in particular about this?
I didn't know what to do with this previous life that I had, and I think we've all kind of got a little bit of that, this sort of life that, this one road that we could have taken, or one road we did take only up to a certain point, and I kept on thinking about it, and the visuals in my head were so strong, and yet I couldn't, if I were a filmmaker and had that palette, I would have done it, but I'm not, and so I wanted to figure out a way of kind of nailing these things down and figuring out what swimming at that level and stopping and then going on and doing what I do now, how it lived or how it sort of haunted me still. And it was really an experiment because I hadn't written that many words before. A lot of my work is just words and pictures. And I kind of worked out in the writing of the book how I use the discipline that I had as a swimmer now. And it all sort of rolled out from there. So I sort of see it rather than as sort of this resting place of something. It's more of a sketchbook. It's more of this kind of a study of something that I just kind of wanted to dissect and pick apart.
Yet it too has a very powerful emotional through line in the sense that there are times when especially when you're talking about your partner James and how he seemed just so happy and satisfied and able to live in the present, and how you longed for that kind of satisfaction and felt somehow that being in competition kind of denied you. Am I right in reading it that way?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a world of high competition, you do see a lot of the world through that prism coming out of that subculture. And so when I saw my husband swim, he would just splash around. His stroke was bad. You know, sometimes he wouldn't get his hair wet, which to me just, I was like, why don't you get your hair wet? And, but he was happy kind of paddling around, and I always wanted to race, and it just wasn't working for our relationship. And I wanted to figure out how to enjoy, you know, in a microcosm, sort of how to enjoy the water in a different way rather than kind of getting in and doing laps. I wanted to kind of bounce up and down and, you know.
And have you found that ability?
Yeah, it's
really
fun.
Oh, great.
I love inner tubes. Lying in inner tubes is so fun.
And have you found the ability to swim in open water?
I'm still a little scared of the open water. Yeah.
Marjorie, your book is this is a fascinating double narrative about Shannon. Great character, by the way. How did you find your story?
You know, I'm not an absent-minded person, but I'm a distracted person. Mm-hmm. So right now I'm in front of you, I'm sitting up here, but for some reason I just keep thinking about this orchid, which has nothing to do with anything, but I'm fixated on this orchid right now. And so go back to 2004. I'm 23 years old. I'm about to start an internship at the Malahat Review, and I'm nervously preparing for this internship because I want to do a good job. And so I go to the archives of the library and I read back issues of the Malahat Review, and I get distracted. And I get distracted by the fact that so many of the stories, for whatever reason, the first letter of the first word of the story begins with Y. And they use a beautiful drop cap and beautiful typography, so I notice this. And I think, oh, I've discovered like the secret to getting published in Malahat Review. You have to submit a story that starts with Y, like the word yellow or you, or even one started with yow. So I was delighted. Anyway, and I took the bus home that day, and I started thinking about the letter, and the sort of first paragraph that opens the book came into my mind. And from there, a first line, which was, my life begins at the Y. And the minute that first line popped into my mind, that was Shannon speaking. It wasn't anybody else. I didn't have to figure out who it was. She was who she was. When we sold the book in the US, my US editor asked me, she said, Marjorie, why does Shannon have a lazy eye? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I finally just said, because she does. You know, she just always was who she was from the very start.
Mm-hmm. So, and when did you figure out that she was an abandoned newborn at the Y?
From that first line, my life begins at the Y, because if your life begins at the Y, whose life would begin at the YMCA? Clearly, she was left by her mother. I mean, it's obvious. There was no other option.
Which is to say that it got you going on to the story.
It got me going on to this story.
Anakana, your story of...
It does occur to me, you could be born at the Y if somebody went into labour in a swimming pool.
True.
Just saying.
True. It's true.
Just to keep the theme going.
Just to keep the theme going here. Just to keep on
Maybe
the
the sequel
continuum.
to Swimming Studies would be that sort of a story. There you go.
Anakana's an exceptional story of loss and grief, funny, and yet, has its tragic moments for sure. And with some, structure that's really quite extraordinary, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. But tell me a little bit about how you found the story. 10 years in the making, so you were looking for quite a while.
Well, kind of like Leanne, I can't swim. And unlike Marjorie, things just don't arrive. I have to go mining. I'm the offspring of coal miners, so I consider malarkey being at that coal face. So basically what happened was, malarkey is the result of the failure to be satisfied with another novel. And I wrote 3 books to write this book. It's an episodic novel, and a big part of finding the novel was finding the form and not being satisfied with a more linear narrative. So it was essentially, as Beckett would say, the need to fail better was how I found it.
That can take us pretty comfortably into the style question, and actually I don't mind starting with you, because I feel like that fractured style, that almost tumultuous style where the narrative is catapulting forward and then thrown back, actually reflects the mindset of your main character. In a way that suggests that style almost is the content. Is that your sense of it, or?
Well, there was a couple of things with this episodic form which then becomes more and more fractured. So each episode is the extrapolation of a single moment in this woman's life. But there were a couple of things. One is absolutely what you're speaking to, which is I had to represent the discombobulation of grief and the accumulation of grief. So anybody here who's experienced, which is probably everybody, any significant loss will know that every subsequent loss becomes more intense until you're staring at obscure stories on the news about somebody killed in a small plane crash, and you'll be overwhelmed. So I wanted to tattoo really onto the page something that spoke to that, and I couldn't do that unless I had employed fragmentation, because it is so discombobulating. When you're grief-stricken, you might be in a shop and it's like you're being stabbed in the kidneys as something comes back to you. Mm-hmm. So I had to capture that for sure.
Well, when we think of style, if you were thinking about it in terms of music, there's such a thing as Beatlesque, or you can watch a Quentin Tarantino movie and know it's a Quentin Tarantino movie, because no matter what his story is, you're going to get all that kind of quirky dialogue and the violence and everything like that. But in your case, would it mean that your style would change if the story changed?
I think it might. Well, I'll have to get back to you in another 10 years. No, it won't be 10 years. I think it might, because I was thinking about this. In episode 4 of the book, the character is approached by a woman who I call Red the Twit, who has an evangelical outpouring to her and confesses she's had carnal knowledge of the main character's husband. And I was just thinking about this the other day, that the way in which the prose is delivered is almost, it's incessant, it's run on, and it's very, I mean, with the benefit of hindsight now, I mean, didn't consciously do this, but it is from, she could be preaching it, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think even within the book, there are, some of the specific content has another form within it, or another style. So yeah, I think so. I'm very interested in what the novel can become.
What about the use of the kind of impersonal pronouns, himself and our woman? Is that a way to universalize the story, or what?
Well, that actually speaks specifically to something in Hiberno English where we use, we tend to say your woman, your man. And so I wanted to respond to that, because when we're talking about women, we tend to say your one. I don't know if there's anybody Irish here, because they can argue with me, throw things. And so I wanted to create something where the reader would be deeply invested in what was happening with the character, to the point of being in her kidneys almost, and that they would think of her like a football team. So so this notion of our woman, meaning she's yours, like she's not just mine, she's yours. So you'd have something invested in her, but it definitely is a thing in which we use in Irish English, which is your man, your woman, your one. And so I made it our woman and himself, because it's so indifferent as well, with the capitals. Yeah, like kind of nations unto themselves, these people.
And they've been powerful ones too, can I say?
And they might invade each other. Why about episode 6?
Rebecca, you started to talk about the style of your stories, and I noticed that most of them are written in the first person. Is this a choice you make particularly, or did you only, did you notice after, or are you always aware that you're writing in the first person?
I think it's sort of a natural tendency, and I teach writers too, so I noticed that a lot of writers have their one way of writing, and I've never really been able to put my finger on like what it is about the person's personality that makes them prefer first person to third. Like, I mean, it must be something about being more comfortable with subjectivity versus objectivity. But I'm not sure. I mean, partly, writing from third person for me always seems like you have to take on a slightly larger worldview than your own, which maybe I feel a little bit nervous about doing that.
But these characters aren't you. These first person characters aren't you. So when you say your own world, I mean,
They're not me, but they're sort of a version of me. I mean, it's almost like, it's like a psychological game. Like, if I were a bolder person who was more willing to make mistakes, what would I do in this situation? Like, sometimes I think it's like you turn the volume up on yourself and you come up with a character that's a version. Although one of these stories I thought was like a version of myself, and it was read out loud on a show called Selected Shorts, where an actress reads it. And she read it, and then one of the questions afterwards was, what was it like to write such a fascist, evil character? And I was like, oh, it's so interesting to try to do that.
yes, you never know what you learn about yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
In the process of writing. But at one point, you actually, in another conversation, mentioned that you used to think of your style as observational, and you actively made a point of changing that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I remember hearing the poet Jory Graham. She gave a lecture, and I don't think she's ever written fiction, but she had rules for fiction writers. And one of them was that characters should try to like touch each other more, whether that means like they get in a fight or they try to like seduce each other. And it's a really interesting like exercise to give yourself as a writer, to constantly move characters closer and closer. So I did try to do that. And when I started writing, I definitely was writing from that point of view. And there is a long tradition of this too in books, where the person who's observing all the action, like maybe, like in The Secret History or a book like that, and their role is to be the one with insights about what's happening versus the one who's an actor in the or party to things. So I always thought it was because I was Canadian, but then when I'm in a group of Canadians, they're like, well, we're not like that. So it's just me, I guess.
Marjorie, I want to turn to you for a second. I noticed when I was reading your book some of the loving detail that you provide, so that a kid is never just wearing a pair of pajamas, they're penguin pajamas, for example. Or
This was before we sold my book to Penguin.
I didn't even think of that. And I mean, also, like, more hauntingly, the descriptions of Shannon during the period of time when she was cutting are quite explicit. When you're working on that element of what I would say is your style, is it work? Is it meticulous work, or does it just come right out? Is it a vision in your head that you see and then you just hammer it onto the page?
It doesn't feel like work. That doesn't feel like work. Revision feels like work. Absolutely. A lot of writing feels like work. But that part of writing why, where I just let Shannon look at everything I want her to look at, and I let her describe everything I want her to see, that never felt like work. And everything to Shannon is a clue. So that's why she notices every single little tiny thing, because everything might be a clue to her identity. Everything might tell her something about someone that she might need to know later. So it's a bit of a survival mechanism on her part.
And what about the double narrative? I should explain that there are two narratives. It's Shannon's story, and then as she interspersed throughout Shannon telling this first-person story is a third-person story of what actually happened with her mother. So we become as invested in finding out what happened to her mother as Shannon is. When did you decide on the double narrative for yourself?
Very early on, I thought that it wouldn't be fair to just tell one side of the story. If you're going to tell the story of an abandoned child, you have to tell the story of the woman who abandoned her. Speaking of points of view, Shannon's voice is in first person. That first line, my life begins at the Y, so I knew I was going to have to write at least half of the novel in first person. Well, first person becomes very quickly tiresome. As much as I love that point of view, it's limited. At one point, the I key on my laptop stopped working. And it's at some point I just thought, I do need to tell Eula's side of things, but this is also going to give me a wonderful opportunity to write in third person, which you talked a little bit about when you teach writing, how writers favor one or the other, and I do. I think of it as being either left or right-handed. Students either want to write first person or third person, and they're adamant about which one they want to write. And I think that then, as we grow as writers, we're able to write in both. But certainly for me, where I started was first person, and now I can just barely stand writing in first person.
But you don't. But you could write in first person forever, right?
I think I could, but maybe I'll experiment.
How's your I key doing on your?
It's okay.
Okay. Leanne, over to you regarding style. It's an interesting question. First of all, I've got two first novelists who, with very distinctive, very different books, but haven't written a second one to see if there's a through line to a particular style, although I'm guessing, well, I can't even guess. And here you are with your book, which is, do you have a problem with the term mashup? Or do
No,
you?
I like it.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. So let me ask you about the decision to use visuals. I take it as a visual artist, it was an of course kind of thing, am I right?
I'm far more comfortable understanding how people read visuals. I kind of know how people will look at something. That's sort of coming from experience art directing newspapers, like really fast kind of words and picture stuff, and also just the emotional import of images. And so I knew I wanted, but I didn't want the text illustrated directly. So in the book, the visual chapters are unto themselves. So you get this.
And maybe we should talk a little bit about what those chapters are. I mentioned the bathing suits, which, by the way, are great. Many vintage items. They're beautiful. And also, Leanne has painted swimming pools. And the first one, what's the first section of?
literally the swimming studies, which are just, they're taken from sort of survey pictures underwater of people doing the breaststroke and the backstroke and the freestyle, and I just sort of sketched those and did a series of those, and had no text along with that because I just wanted the reader to sort of see this repetitive action, and that comes really early in the book. So there's this sense of, there's this moment of repetition and of, you know, just that's what swimmers do. They do the exact same thing over and over again, and then again, and then. So I felt I needed that kind of an introduction.
But
to the
I
sport.
experienced the visuals as almost, I know that they have emotional impact, but I almost felt that they were a little bit of a break from some of the raw vulnerability that's evident in the text. Is there a way in which you were kind of relieved to have that, so that because of the extent to which you were exposing yourself as a memoirist?
I think so, yeah. I mean, again, I am a little bit more comfortable talking with words and pictures, and so at those places I knew very well what I was saying and how it would be read. And I think 5 chapters was enough, because those other chapters did need to be explained through writing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they were fun.
They were
way
more fun. All right,
Yeah.
I understand. The interesting thing about style is that some people feel like the actual process of creation is what, literally the process of creation dictates the style. So I'm sorry to use a cinematic reference, but say the films of Mike Leigh, which are all done via improv. He has all of his actors come in, they almost invent the script, so that when you're actually seeing the movie, the style of the movie reflects that process, I believe. You get a certain kind of authenticity. They're talking to each other as if they've known each other forever. Is there any way in your process, Rebecca, that is reflected in the style that comes out? I know it's a
Yeah, well, I mean, I love what you're describing, and one of the things I really have to try to do when I'm working is like let that kind of spontaneity in. I mean, if you can think of a writer as being able to improv, that's an interesting idea, because you know, there's the part of your brain that's trying to make things work and trying to bring order, but then you have to figure out a way via, I don't know what, like lots of caffeine or something that lets the other part of yourself in, that like has sort of like newer, more radical ideas than the part that's a little bit more conservative and is trying to get to the end of the story. So to
Is
me,
there a
that's
conservative
struggle.
part?
A conservative part to what?
To the brain?
Yeah,
There is.
It's the one that wants to contain everything, right?
I think so, yeah.
I think I missed that chip.
No, that's good.
I need to get that one in the post.
What about in your process, Anakana?
Oh, you don't want to know.
Oh.
It's ugly. It is ugly. It involves a hell of a lot of wasted paper. No, I'm just messing. It is ugly, yeah, it's very difficult. I'm interested in collage, what Leanne is speaking to. But I'm curious about this distinction between the visual and the written word, because I don't really see it. And I don't see this, these demarcations of first person and third person, because I use a rotating point of view. So I guess I'm always curious about trying to get the water out of the swimming pool. I'm not that interested in what's in the pool. I want to get it out the sides and just push out a bit. Now, some people will argue that is a grave error, but I see them outside afterwards.
And she's Irish.
And I'm Katie Taylor.
And if you'll recall, the women's Irish boxing team won all the gold medals. So,
Just
as she reminded me earlier this evening.
Yeah. So, for example, point of view, right? I'm terribly perturbed by point of view. So I went in there and it was sunk for a very, very long time. But ultimately, I was so frustrated, like, well, I want to give the reader a whole woman in an unremitting manner. I don't want to give them a half. I don't want to give them a bit. And I don't want to give them lots and lots of women. I just want to give them this one woman. And so I decided that the way to do it was to rotate the point of view. But it didn't seem like anybody actually got that was what I was doing. But that was kind of what I was trying to do, was keep a like 360 on her and make it so claustrophobic that you can't get away from her.
Well, you can't in your book. She's very strong character.
So if you don't like her, we haven't met anybody yet that doesn't like her.
Leanne, is there a prose stylist that you admire in the true stylist way? Like some people say you shouldn't even notice the style, that as soon as you notice the style, it's failed. Or what's the great Elmore Leonard quote as he's writing? If I sense that I'm writing, I delete it. Or, you know. Of course, he does have a style, so who knows what he really means. But my point is there a true stylist you admire?
I'm not sure if she'd be considered a stylist, but the one writer that I needed to kind of write this book was Joanne Beard. And her first book was first person, and she was talking about her life, and it was unlike any kind of memoir I'd ever read. It was funny and really intimate, and but I don't know if she's considered a stylist. Is anyone considered it? I mean, yeah.
Well, I guess when I refer to a stylist, it's somebody whose style you do notice. That's what I'm talking
Like
about.
Gary Steingart.
Yeah.
Or John Banville.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Or Marcel Proust, you know. I mean, you know you're going to get the big sentences when you read Proust, for example. Like, and you want to bathe in them,
Gertrude.
and that's fine. And that's more what I was referring to.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, have you ever read books where style kind of got in the way? Can style get in the way? Do you think?
Well, I've thrown books at the wall, but I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with the style. Usually, it's I think there's a whole bunch of factors, and I'm not sure that. I mean, I like this theory that form and content are interrelated, and style and content, you know, they're speaking to each other. They're like a kind of left ovary and a right ovary, or a left arm and a right arm.
And it has to make sense to you. Some one style with anything, in anything, can make sense to you or not. You know, it's something I think you respond to naturally or emotionally or rationally. So,
What do you think, Marjorie?
I think overly stylized writing is too intellectual. I just think it's too, if I have to struggle to understand what you're trying to say because you're so busy showing off how beautifully you can write, I don't really want to read your
or
writing.
how experimental. I mean, there's a place.
I remember Michael Cunningham came to Iowa while I was there, and he said to all of us, he said, actually he was just talking to one person, it was very awkward to her. He said, intelligent girl, look at all your sentences. This wasn't me, by the way. Intelligent girl, look at all your sentences and give them a grade or A or B, and then delete all your A's.
Oh, interesting.
And I stand by that. I really, and I'm like that when I read. If I can see the writer writing,
You can smell it.
you can smell it. Something. It's just not.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that I don't like beautifully stylized writing. I do. But when that takes over, when that's the focal point, when the writer's louder than the story, then that's not interesting anymore.
Oh my goodness, I'm horrified.
You are? Why are you horrified?
Well, I just feel so differently about it.
Really?
I feel very differently about it, and I'm kind of the word story bothers me a great deal more than. I mean, I'm interested in language, so.
As am I. It's not that I'm not.
Absolutely, I find that story is just such a sort of a dead end in some ways. I feel very differently about it.
What else should we call it, though? I mean, we're speaking extemporaneously. So.
We could call it situations.
Fine. Fine.
Experience?
I'm interested in something that's a little more, I guess. Yeah, I just feel very differently about it. I become quite intrigued when somebody is trying to do something that's highly stylized and different. I'm kind of intrigued. Like I love Georges Perec, and I love the way that people will bring in limits on stuff and try to, like the Oulipo people, they try to write within these, or the situationists. I thought Michelle Bernstein's ideas of writing these novels that would be pastiche. Yeah, I feel quite differently about it.
You know, we might not actually, if we looked at the same passages.
Yeah, maybe.
We might not actually, because we probably both love words and love language. I'm probably just bristling at certain particular writers I have in my mind.
Well,
We
maybe-
need to have a bottle of wine,
We
and
need to
then
have
we
a
need
bottle
to.
of wine
Let's
and just
bring it on.
talk about it.
Yeah.
But maybe what you're saying is that, if you're so busy trying to unpack something and the ideas are so hard to penetrate, then the emotional force of the story goes. Is that?
Well, that's maybe a better way of saying it, is that I like to feel something when I read.
And style can get in the way of
It
emotion.
can get in the way of emotion.
Do you think so, Rebecca? Oh,
No, go ahead.
Did
That
you think
was
so,
me.
Rebecca?
Well, whenever I think of style, I always think of Alice Munro, because I think of that as sort of an invisible style in a way. Because I was just reading her story, Runaway, the story from the collection. And like every sentence that you read in it, I'm sure a lot of people have read it, you're like, oh, I think I could have written that sentence. Probably I could have written that one. But then you get to the end and you're in such a mysterious place that only she could have ever written of anyone in the world. And there's no like trail there that you can see. But I think she's an amazing stylist, but also an invisible one.
See, that's interesting. The question of whether style should be, as soon as it's visible, have you lost your way?
Yeah.
Or not?
I don't know if this is going to apply, but I have this prism, this thing, this binary that I sometimes look at the world through, and as an illustrator, I can do this. Is it illustration or is it art? And it's kind of like, maybe some of the style we're talking about is illustration, where it's an embellishment of something we're comfortable with, something we already know. It's pretty, it can be gorgeous, it can be absolutely sort of, and then there's art, which is a little bit more something we've never seen before, something that's challenging, something that does have beauty, but it's calling something illustration and calling something art, it's very subjective and it's very, but I kind of like to go through the world saying, okay, that's illustration, that's art, and it sort of feels like it could apply a little bit to what we're saying. And Alice Munro, I'd say art. I would say art.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Alice Munro wins. All right.
It depends what our reading purpose is, though, and we didn't define that. Are we reading for inspiration? Are we reading for pleasure?
Comfort, yeah.
Are we? I mean, that without defining that, then it becomes sort of impossible to have this discussion, because then it becomes so abstract and so broad.
I think we need a great deal more interrogation into different forms and types of reading. I think one of the great errors that we're making within writing and publishing is way too much focus on writers and being writers, and not nearly enough focus on interrogating different ways in which we read and different ways in which we can read, and actually giving reading more and more status rather than, chronic discussions about how we write, which really aren't terribly interesting. How we read is a lot more. Obviously,
I think you guys are doing pretty well.
Tonight, accepting.
Okay, but unfortunately, we have a ton of readers in the audience who want to weigh in on this conversation, and I'm afraid. I mean, you'll all get to talk more because they're going to state their claim, and you get to talk and respond. So I would like to open the floor right now to talk about actually anything you want. Of course, there is a theme tonight on style versus content. Maybe it's when style meets content. It's all of the above. So questions from the floor, please. And I'll remind you that I will have to repeat them because I do believe we're on tape tonight. And for the benefit of the medium, I'll be repeating the question. Questions, comments, anything? Yes. Catherine.
I actually have a question for Leanne. I'm curious about your book. I'm particularly curious about how the editorial process was. Did you have to sort of act as a translator for your editor with the visuals?
The question is how to Leanne is about her editorial process, in particular about the visuals, and whether she had to kind of translate for the editor how the visuals fit in and what they meant.
No, I didn't have to translate. My editor sort of understood the rests that these things provided. She understood that I was very controlling about art directing it and pacing it. And so when I started writing the book, it was all text, and I sort of said, oh, there's going to be some pictures. And so they were expecting it, and then it was sort of up to me. It was given a lot of freedom. I remember one chapter, there's a chapter about other swimmers where I was just going to have paintings of the swimmers' faces, and I had a talk where I realized it wasn't enough. It was a little bit there's too much space. And I added text to that chapter, so it was words and pictures. But then these two other chapters where there's nothing. And so there was a little bit of dialogue, but I didn't have to, I didn't really have to explain or, translate.
Any other questions? I saw a question over here. Yes, sir.
I was interested in the design of the book, Leanne, because it doesn't have a split paper cover, and it reminds me of Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. I just wondered, as an art director, how it had something to do with that.
The question is, tell us a bit about the cover of your book. It reminds our audience member of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys covers, and did you have anything to do with that aspect of the book?
Did I have anything to do with it? I designed it, yeah. And it's sort of in all of my contracts that I designed the cover. And with this, as I explained before, I wanted it to feel like a bit of a sketchbook, like a cahier, like a, I didn't want it to be wrapped up in a dust jacket. And so it did the foil stamp, the matte foil stamp, and just so it would feel a little bit more like a Hardy Boy than it is. It could be banged around and mucked
Yes,
up.
I guess what he meant is also the way it feels. It's
Yeah.
like those old books. It has no blur. It has just true hardcover.
Yeah.
Has no.
Can I look
Yeah,
at it?
please. Any other questions? Yes.
I was interested, Leanne, when you were talking about how you kind of go through assessing what's illustration and what is art, and putting that thought together with something that Anakana said about the focus on the writer as a writer in the process of writing as opposed to the written word. And I was wondering whether, so the way this came together was to say that illustration is often guided by commercial restrictions or needs or goals. And do you think that the focus on the writer now may be affecting style or content in a broad way, in a way that illustration is not?
Okay, I need to frame the question. Let me.
That's a good question.
Let me try. Okay. The question began by mentioning Leanne's distinction between illustration and art. And the questioner was suggesting that perhaps the distinction has to do with the commercial element of the illustration, and wonders whether the accent now on writers is creating a certain commercialization of the process. Am I close?
I think so.
Okay.
I think what I'm hearing, and I can be very loosely interpretive. I think it speaks absolutely to what I'm saying about reading. I think that the market has co-opted absolutely nearly every aspect of literature, to the point where it's affecting how we read. It's affecting what we're reading for. I'm ambitious as a reader. I want to be challenged, and it's becoming harder and harder for us as readers to find our way to that work, because there's been such a seismic shift in publishing. I mean, back in the day, 1998, we had small presses were publishing avant-garde, very cutting-edge work. But because the bigger publishers have let's say, shifted a bit to the right in that regard, the small presses are now shifted, and truly interrogative, dynamic work is happening at people's kitchen tables. I really think it's a state of emergency, not to be alarmist or anything. and I'm very worried as a. Thank you. I thought there was 85 of us, but there might be 87 of us out there. I'm very concerned about it, because as a writer, I spent 10 years writing this novel. I don't think it's particularly formally experimental or challenging. I think it's really pretty mild. And I reach a point today where I go to myself, scratching my head, well, that was kind of a bit of a silly thing to do. I mean, other than the fact that I've had a fantastic response to my book, But, if I ever want to fix my kids' teeth, it may not happen. So I'm deeply concerned. And I would encourage people to be extremely ambitious in their reading. Because as readers, like it's getting so hard for readers, this market force. But I'm optimistic as well.
James.
I completely agree. I mean, when people talk about stories, especially writers, if I want story, I will watch Game of Thrones. Literature is made of language. If you're not doing something interesting with the language, why would I read it other than it's a good page turner? I mean, literature has to be something more than entertainment. I mean, it has to be a deeper form of pleasure, or why bother?
Our man from Quill and Choir is saying that literature has to be more than entertainment.
It has to work on the level of language, not story. Because story, TV tells stories, movie tells stories, anyone can tell a story.
I disagree.
Does it not need to do both?
Yes,
Shouldn't it
of
do
course
both? I mean, from teaching creative writing now for years, my favorite students are always the students who can write the most beautiful sentence. The sentence that is more beautiful than anything that I could ever write. And I love it, and I covet it, and I read their stories, and it's like being transported to some sort of beautiful, incredible world. But I haven't learned a damn thing, and I don't know what it's about, and it doesn't hold together in any kind of a way, and at the end, we're not at a different place than that we were at the beginning. And so I think there needs to be a very fine balance that, of course, and I labor over every single one of my sentences, but if each sentence isn't getting us somewhere.
Well, what is the story of Ulysses? What is the story of To the Lighthouse?
Ulysses, seriously?
Oh, the question is, what is the story of Ulysses here? And the answer here is, Ulysses, are you kidding me? So perhaps you'd like to stand up, speak out to the crowd. This is interesting now.
Now we're warming up.
Now we're getting there.
Why is the word story being used as a pejorative?
Wait.
Wait.
Not even. I feel like I'm...
Turn around. So we can all hear, they can hear if you're going to speechify.
I'm not sure exactly how I want to say this. I've been haggling my friend to give me the words, and she can't. No one can. My problem is this. There are 4 fucking smart women on stage right now, and you're talking about Ulysses? Are you fucking kidding me? So my question is this. Here's what I was trying to formulate. As I was sitting here, I feel like, my book came out a couple years ago, and I got asked a lot of questions, and I got really freaked out, and, whatever. But everyone always focused on the fact that I was a girl.
No, I mentioned To the Lighthouse, which is written by
It's already, I'm moving somewhere else. But thank you you were kind of like a springboard. Thank you.
Don't take it personally, James, is the point. Keep going.
So, I was trying to figure out what to ask you guys so an issue I've had and thought about is, the reason I didn't put my hand up is because I don't know how to articulate it. So
You're doing fine.
Yeah. Keep going.
You're doing a good job.
Someone take over the question as soon as you hear it. I felt like
Go, Leanne.
when my book came out, I got asked all these kind of invasive questions that were sort of like, what does it mean? Like this, like what do you, what? I don't know, I just kind of panicked, but I feel like with the 4 of you, 4 smart women on stage, and no one is talking about the fact that you're 4 smart women on stage, because we're all trying to pretend that you're just writers, except for the fact that you're female writers. And I would like to pretend that you're not female writers. I would like to pretend that you're just writers, except for I'm a woman.
So do you want to ask us about being women writers?
I want to ask you
Work away.
the same questions. I want to know, I think about what I used to get asked when I was writing, and I just feel like I want to know something more than that. I want to know more than what's it like to be a woman writer. I got asked that. That's like such a...
So what do you want to know?
I want to know when someone asks you, what is it like to be a woman? What I got really mad about it, I felt like, isn't there another conversation we can be having?
I don't get asked that much.
I don't.
Some of you might. I just feel like, isn't there something?
Have you been asked?
I've been asked
Okay.
that a lot. Well, my book's about girls. My protagonist is a young girl, and it's mostly about women, and there's very few men in my book. And so I do, and I have been asked, would men be interested in your novel? And I mean, I hope they would be, but I'm not an idiot. So, my next novel is going to be almost exclusively about men, and I don't know. And we'll see how that goes.
But can I point out that most readers of fiction are women? So
Yes, I know
it's
that.
actually advantageous to be, I think, writing towards women. Maybe.
The question is there something gendered about the debate between story and style?
Yes.
Is there something what?
Gendered.
Oh,
Thank
Okay.
you. The question,
That's a
and
good
ably
question.
put, and I
That's a good
thank you, is
Yeah.
the debate, does gender factor into the debate between story and style?
I think possibly, yeah. I was at a panel at the Vancouver Festival last week about women in literature. And yeah, I think that, I'm thinking of the Helen DeWitt who just published Lightning Rods by And Other Stories. And I remember reading an article in the New York Observer or a paper like that, which described all of these editors who could not get past the premise of what she posited, which was this notion of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if Franzen or one of his rugby playing friends, I don't know, I can't think of their names right now, wrote a book like that, would those editors, recoil as much? I think there possibly is. I think it might be tougher if you're writing about women and you are a woman to actually write in a stylized book or a formally experimental book in a way that it may not be if you're a dude. But I don't have any science on it.
Well, I just need some more formal definitions because I just feel like this is getting too vague. Now, stories being thrown about is sort of a pejorative. Is that because when we say story, are we saying plot? Like, what exactly are we talking about? And when we say style, do we mean that the writer loves language, or the writer's more of popular fiction and doesn't give a damn about language? I mean, what exactly are we talking about, and why is it a battle?
I don't think it's a battle. I just think that story is something that many different mediums can do.
Yes.
But writing is made up of language. So my only point was that if the author doesn't have a careful attention to language, then anybody can tell a story. But something is elevated by the style. It can be.
Who would disagree with you on that?
I don't know. That was my
Yeah,
only
what do you-
point, and then suddenly it became a point.
So,
To the Lighthouse is because they don't actually have a very strong narrative thrust. You don't remember the Lighthouse because of the story. You remember it because of the character.
he's saying there's no story into the lighthouse. Another audience member wants to mention that Mrs. Ramsey died. Yeah, I understand.
So the question is, though, do you feel any sense of gender, have you come across that? Do you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I love words. I love language. The beginning of my novel starts with almost a prose poem.
I love that.
To focus on just the story of my novel. I mean, the story of my novel sounds absurd. A girl is abandoned at the YMCA, and then she searches for her birth mother. I mean, it sounds like a bad made-for-TV movie, right? So I would hope that I guess in a sense, maybe I would hope that one looks beyond the story. But I still don't really know.
But I like Tom's question about the gender and style thing. I mean, what makes what, if you're talking about Joyce and Woolf, maybe Woolf made more sense to, I don't know, I mean, I think she made more sense to women readers and men readers, and so did Joyce to some degree. So I don't think there is, actually. I think it actually is a little bit, if you're experimenting and if you're writing, you're not necessarily writing for women or men, you're just pushing it. And I would like to think that that's not gendered.
One more question. I'm sorry because I knew it was going to get, I knew it was going to get interesting, but I'm unfortunately forced to ask one more question from
This
here.
woman as well has been waiting for a long time at the back.
In the back? Okay, two more questions if Leah will let me have it. She says yes. Go.
I think that to get towards the end, to get back to our key terms, right? It's content we're talking about.
Yeah.
Story is one aspect of content. The story is part of the content, and I think that style is easier for me to define. You say a writer writes in short, choppy sentences, or writes whole paragraphs in a single sentence. It could be Joyce, it could be Hemingway. But I think in our age, we're not losing, or at least the sense of the definitions of content are becoming much more diffuse. Not long, a couple of decades ago, a writer was supposed to have something to say, and you could write as an omniscient narrator in the third person and get into everyone's head and make your pronouncements. That kind of writing is really going by the by. What I would really love is if, just briefly, we could go around the panel and everyone give me their 1 or 2 sentence definition of content. What is content?
Rebecca?
Okay. Well, I'm going to connect that to something you said, because one of the things I think is a really productive question for writers is, what can writing do that other forms can't do, forms of narrative? And one of the things I think it can do, in addition to language, is collapse experience into meaning, so that you go from something happening into how people feel about what's happening. So to me, that's the content of literature, that moment. And maybe the moment that the illustration becomes art, to me, is when the inner life rises.
Marjorie? Content.
Content. Okay. Well, again, this is. I do bristle at these terms because they don't seem very practical. But I'll do my best. Content for me. There's reality, and then there's what's in books, and what's in books is more real than reality, and maybe that's all I can say about what content is.
Anakana.
Pretty.
Yeah, content. Well, content for me would be, very, very wide frames of reference. I'm quite interested in the evolution of the book as a portal. I know this is sort of slightly deviating from your intended question, but I keep thinking about the economic paradigm that we all face in the publishing industry, and so I've begun to conceive of a technological thing, which would be like our book would become a portal through which we curate other material related to it. So when you talk about content, I immediately move to my sort of futuristic publishing ideas. But content could be, I'm very interested in what Leanne's doing in this collaging of different forms. So within my books, within my novel anyway, I would certainly say there's everything in there, from feckin' watering cans to feckin' Middle Eastern politics to, it's undefinable. I can't really, I can't really pin it down. But it's a very odd duck.
Leanne, do you have a question?
I think I would say, I was trying to think of describing something I came across and saying, well, I like the content of it. And I think what I mean when I say that is that I like the art in it. I like being told something and seeing something and hearing something that I've never heard or seen put that way before. And it can be a tiny moment. The rest of it can be completely like, meh. But then I think it's like a nugget of awesome, like a nugget of art. I know art is difficult to talk about, it's broad, but just a nugget of awesome.
A nugget of awesome. I have really, honestly, my friends, time for one last question, and I saw it from somebody who was waiting here for a while.
Yeah.
Please speak up.
So
No.
you sort of bounced around different topics, but back to what we were talking about previously about being a woman writer in particular. It seems most of you are writing. Your characters are a woman. Is that because it's easier? And I know for me, writing, it's always a girl. Is that the case for you guys?
So the question is, as writers, do you find it easier to write characters who are female, and first person, I guess, for you, Rebecca, who are female? And I'll start with you.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I can't write I've never written fiction, so I'm kind of off the table.
She's off the table.
Anakana.
Well, I find it Oh, Jesus.
That might
is
have been me.
I think that might have been me. I'm exploding. I'm explosive. I find it much easier to write male characters, to be honest. And yeah, it's much easier for me to write men. I don't know why that is. Women give me a lot of trouble. But I call my book a she. I call her. Because it's so relentlessly about one woman. I'm very proud of that, you know. I feel very proud of that.
You should be.
Thanks. I don't feel proud of much.
Rebecca.
Well, there's one story in there that's told from the point of view of a man, and it was I was given the assignment by a magazine to write this story, so I had to write from that point of view. And at first, I really tried to think how men think. I walked around and tried to absorb that, and I couldn't do it. And then someone gave me the advice to just forget it and just write from a consciousness. So then I did, and I wrote it. But then someone told me afterwards that. A reviewer that I actually knew said it read like a weird womanish type of man.
I know those guys.
Marjorie.
We want those guys.
The majority of my short stories have male protagonists. When I write in first person, but when I write in first person, it's 50-50. Shannon's a pretty androgynous character. She even dresses like a man in a couple of the scenes. One of my short stories is in first person, and it's told from the perspective of a man. And when I workshopped it, everybody gave me a lot of hell for that. And so I sent it off anonymously to an editor, and he selected it for publication. And when he found out that a woman had written it, he was actually quite irritated. But anyway, I like both. Absolutely. I don't think I favor one or the other. As I said, my next book will be mostly about men. So,
Well, it's my hope that, and I'm confident that this will be the case, that these writers and artists will continue to irritate and inspire and impress us along the way. A reminder that you can have FaceTime individually with these writers in the Marilyn Brewster Hub along the way. Thank you to the IFOA. Thank you, Leanne Shapton, Anakana Schofield, Rebecca Lee, Marjorie, Celona. Thank you very much.